Doesn't it, though?
All right, welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming out tonight. We're so thrilled to have Matt back here tonight for his third visit, right? I think so. He's the author of 4 novels, the latest of which is The Perfect Comeback of Caroline Jacobs. He's also an elementary school teacher, and he was awarded the West Hartford Teacher of the Year, and he was a finalist for Connecticut Teacher of the Year. You may have heard of him, or at least you've heard his voice on the radio, for the storytelling he's done on the Moth radio hour. He's a multiple Moth StorySLAM Grand Slam champion.
Very kind of you, yes.
Which, if you don't know about the Moth, it means he can tell a really good story. He also writes really good stories, including his latest, which is irreverent, hilarious, and so real. Please join me in welcoming Matthew Dix to Water Street Bookstore.
Thank you very much. And I don't see Denise and Jim are wonderful people, and thank you for hosting me and for feeding us tonight. That's really kind, really wonderful. I wish that every bookstore I visited, I had like people who lived right next to it who would cook food for the appearance. That would be amazing. Like, honey, let's get on that. Let's get to okay. That would be fantastic. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. I'm going to talk a little bit tonight. I'm not going to talk about the book. I gave up on that a long time ago. I used to read from the book, and when I went to author readings, that was the part that I hated the most, was listening to them read. I also can't read my book. Once the book is published, I never read it, because I edit the sentences as I read it. You know, I'm just never quite satisfied. Someone asked me recently, when do you know your book is done? And I say, when my editor tells me it's done, that's when it's done. It's never really done in my heart. It was just a sentence. I just handed in my next book to my editor, and there was a sentence that said, "She took her hand back," or "she took back her hand." And I switched it like 20 times. Every time I read through the sentence, I flipped it the other way. I'm still like, I don't know what way it is in the world right now in her hands, but it's just, I can't handle it. So I'm not going to read. So I'm going to tell you some stories about how I became a writer. I fundamentally believe that everyone should be writing, and I think everyone in front of me should be writing. And I think if you're not writing, you're kind of crazy. I think what happens is people don't write because they've run into some awful English teacher at some point in their life. Probably an English teacher who didn't actually write him or herself. Like, we tend to have a lot of teachers who teach writing who don't actually do any writing themselves. And then they probably damaged you in some way. You wrote something and they made you feel bad about it. And with math, if you get the problem wrong, it tends not to affect your self-esteem and psyche, because it's sort of not about you. But when you when someone tells you something that you've written isn't very good, I think it damages people. And I think that's a terrible thing. So I worry when I talk to people that they think that writers are special or talented people. And there are writers who are special and talented. But then there are writers like me who have published 4 novels, and I don't know what the hell I'm doing most of the time. And I'm really not that special. And if I think about my writing career, I know how close I came to not having a writing career. Like how narrow that gap is that I had to find my way through, and really how I'm standing here today because of other people who helped me on the way. So I'm just going to give you some stories about my path, so you can sort of hopefully be convinced that by the time I'm done that I'm not very special, and it required a great deal of assistance and a great deal of luck. And if I can do it, you could do it. You know, my goal tonight is really, I'd love for you to love my books and read my books and give them away in large quantities. But really what I'd love is for you to leave the store tonight and go home and start writing, and write for the rest of your life. That's what that would make me truly happy. So I'm fortunate enough, I know the date that I became a writer. I can pinpoint the exact date. It was December 2nd, 1988. I was a 17-year-old junior in high school. And I was growing up at a time when my parents and my guidance counselors and my teachers, they never said the word college to me. Like, that word was never spoken to me as a child. And I grew up poor, very, very poor. So the idea that I might go to college someday wasn't in the cards for me. I didn't understand why, but it wasn't. I would sit in my class and I would see my friends get called one by one to the guidance office to talk about safety schools and SATs. And things like that. And I would sit in class and just wait for my turn for them to call me. And they never called my name. So I never took SATs, and I never learned anything about colleges, and I just figured this isn't going to be for me. So school for me, I liked learning a great deal, but the grades didn't mean much to me, because I knew when I was 18 I was going to be kicked out of my house and I'd be living on my own, and whether I got an A or a C in English class wasn't going to change anything. So I became one of those kids that sort of found clever ways to get through school. And so in English class I had Mr. Campo in 1988, and earlier, before December 2nd, he assigned us a book report, for example, and book reports are the worst. Like, I forbid my books to ever be used as book reports. But so he took us down to the library, and I found the highest shelf in the library, and I found the furthest book over in the library, and I found the dustiest book in the library. And I took it off the shelf, and it was a book called Umu by Herman Melville, like the book by Melville that no one actually reads. And because because the card catalog was sort of a stamp back then, I could see that book hadn't been read in 10 years in this library. So I took it to Mr. Campo, and I said, Mr. Campo, this is the book I'd like to do a book report on. And he took it in his hands. He said, oh, this is great. I've never read this. And I thought, perfect, that's exactly what I wanted you to say. And so I went home that night and I wrote a book report on what I imagined Umu would be about had I actually read the book. And I still have the book report to this day. I brought it in because it's 1988. There's no internet for him to go check what this book is about. I knew he wasn't going to read the book, and just in case he was, I held on to the book until I got my grade back, because there was no way he was going to find another copy of this book that no one reads. And so I have the book report to this day. It's a B+. And I still never read the book, but that's how I got through school. I did things like that. So I'm in Mr. Campo's class, and in the month of November we're learning about satire. And for the first time in my life I'm pretty excited about something in school, because this form of writing appeals to me. Like, I can sort of make fun of people in an ironic way. I'm very sarcastic. This is great. And so I go home and I write the satire assignment that Mr. Campo has assigned to me. And I have great enthusiasm for the first time in forever. And I bring it in and I hand it to Mr. Campo, and on December 2nd, 1980, he puts it back on my desk. And it's a B-. And I'm pissed. I am angry about this B-, because I know I have written like some of the greatest satire that has ever been written on this planet. So I take the paper and I charge to the front of the room. Mr. Campo's in the front of the room. He's getting his stuff ready to teach. Mr. Campo's a short, bald man, and in my experience, those short, bald men, they come in two forms. They're either very funny or very angry. That's the two ways and he's the angry version of short and bald. He's just always angry. I love him. He's a great teacher, but he's always pissed off. And so I go up and I tell him that this B- is wrong. You don't know what you're doing, and it should be better. And because it's Mr. Campo and he's angry all the time, he fires back. And we're in a shouting match in the front of the classroom. And I'm in a class that it's a weird class for me to be in, because it is full of girls who take school very seriously, and a few boys who do too. And then there's me. Like, somehow I've landed in this class that I don't belong in. And they're not used to kids shouting at teachers and teachers shouting back, so the room goes silent as we're arguing back and forth. And eventually, Mr. Campo stops and says, stop, listen, here's what we're going to do. You're going to... Honey, he's got to do something. I can't.
He's going to the children's room.
All right, I can't. He's killing me. I'm parenting while I'm talking. This is a fail. All right, good. Goodbye, Charlie. So I tell Mr. Campo, we get in the fight, and at the top he's written, not satire, too obvious. And so he tells me, here's what we're going to do. You're going to read it to the class. And if the class believes that it's satire, I'll make your B- into an A-. But if the class agrees with me that it is too obvious and is not satire, your B- becomes a C-, which is a great, best teaching lesson I've ever gotten. You raise the stakes on kids whenever you can. And I said, yes, I'm 17, I'm ready to take on the world, absolutely. So I stand in front of the class and I begin to read my satire out loud. And I'm one line into it when I hear a girl laugh. Heather Davidson, the girl I have loved, probably until I met my wife. And I can't believe it. My heart soars. And I continue to read, and slowly, one by one, all of my classmates begin to laugh. They think it's funny. And by the time I'm done, they're all laughing. And I have even heard Mr. Campo snicker a couple times. And so when he says, raise your hand if you think that what Matt's written is satire, every hand, including Mr. Campo's, goes up. And he explains to me, he says, on the page it does not read as satire. But you bring so much of your sarcasm to the piece while you're reading it that it comes across as satire. So he makes my B minus into an A minus. I still have the paper. There's an angry red scrawl over the B minus, and above it there is an A minus. And that's the moment I become a writer. Because 3 things happen in that moment for me. The first thing is I make girls laugh. And you cannot underestimate the value of that to this day. Like, I write essentially to make my wife laugh and to impress her. And Heather Davidson laughed. It was the greatest thing ever. I also beat the man, which doesn't usually happen. High school boys like to think they have beaten the man, but they don't. That just doesn't happen. But on this day, I told a teacher that he was wrong about his professional assessment of my work. And then I proved him to be wrong. And that was huge for me. But the biggest thing that happened to me that day was I changed my future a tiny bit. I made a B minus into an A minus. And for a kid who had no future whatsoever, nothing, I discovered that I could write stuff and change someone's mind. And so I had an enthusiasm for writing I had never felt before. And I came back to school on Monday and I started my first business. I started writing term papers for my classmates. $50 for an untyped term paper and $100 for a typed term paper. And with the money that I earned, I bought my first car, a 1978 Chevy Malibu. If you want the formula for a writer, you take a boy and you have him write something that makes the girl he loves laugh. And then you give him money for it and you allow him to buy his first car. That will turn any boy into a writer. That is what happened to me. And from that day, I have written every single day of my life, without exception. I have not missed a day. The day that this girl was born, Clara, we were in the room, the delivery room, and there's a machine that my wife's on one side of the room, and she's hooked up to this machine that's got waves. And when the waves crest, that's the time that Alicia has to push. And then when the waves dip into troughs, we're just waiting. There's nothing to do but wait. And the troughs are long in the beginning. It's like a push and then a long time before you get to push again. So on the other side of the room, I have my laptop set up. And I'm on a chair with casters so I can roll back and forth. So I'm working on my second book, Unexpectedly Milo, on the laptop and watching the machine. And when I see a wave coming, I roll across the room and I hold my wife's hand. And the first few times that she's pushing, I'm pushing too. And then the nurse comes over and says, "Nothing good will come of you pushing." So, which is true. So I stop pushing, but I hold her hand. And then when the wave is done and she's done her push, I roll back across the other side and I work on my book. And the nurse asks right away, "Would you like me to find you another husband?" But my wife is no fool. She knew that if I finished that book, Milo, she was going to get at least a year at home with Clara. She was going to be able to stay at home. And so she was mentally pushing me to that side of the room as much as possible. She wanted that book done. But I wrote on my wedding. I wrote every single day. It's just become a part of me that I can't not do. But I didn't become a writer. I did get kicked out of my house when I was 18, and I ended up in a lot of trouble for a long time. I ended up getting arrested and tried for a crime I didn't commit, and I was homeless for a period of my life, and it was a struggle for a long time. But eventually I make it to college, which is great, and I go to school for creative writing, so I think I'm on my path, and things are looking good. And then I graduate from college when I'm about 29, and I'm ready to write my first novel, and I start writing really seriously. And I become a teacher at the same time, so I teach 5th grade, so I figure I'm probably not going to make my fortune immediately on writing, so I've established this other career, which I love. So I'm writing, and what happens is I'm writing there's an author named Dean Koontz, and he's an author who I don't particularly like very much, but I've read some of his books. And the writing that I'm doing sounds like bad Dean Koontz as I'm writing it. So I'm writing stories that sound like an author who I don't like very much, but it's a bad version of the author I don't like. So I'm failing. I'm doing really poorly. And again and again and again, I'm starting novels. I'm getting 10, 20, 30 pages into them, and I'm realizing how terrible they are. And it goes on for about 5 years, where I cannot get a book started that I feel good about. And I quit. I kind of quit on fiction. I come to the realization that maybe I wasn't supposed to write fiction, and maybe I'll write for magazines or newspapers, or I'll write a memoir, but I decide I'm not going to be able to write the novel that I've always wanted to write. And I'm in that state when my phone rings one day, and my friend Shep calls, and he asks me one of the most important questions I've ever been asked in my life. He calls and says, "Do you want to play Dungeons and Dragons with us?" Now, Shep is a 35-year-old man at the time. And he has decided that he's going to play Dungeons and Dragons with a bunch of my friends. He's going through a midlife crisis, and instead of like buying a Corvette or cheating on his wife, he's decided he's going to go into the basement with other 35-year-old men and play a game that we used to play when we were 13. And at the time, I'm single, and I would like to not be single. I'd like to find a girl. And I'm thinking that Dungeons and Dragons is not going to help me find a girl in any way. And I'm not really interested in Dungeons and Dragons, so I say, no, thank you. You have a good time. And it's all my friends except for me, but I'm like, you guys have a great time. I'm not interested. And he hangs up. And then he calls back 3 days later. And he says, okay, you don't want to play Dungeons and Dragons, but what if you write the adventures for us that we will play? And I say, no, that sounds worse than playing Dungeons and Dragons. That's like work. And you can buy those things. I see them in books. Like, you can get those things. And Shep says to me, you once told me you were going to write. And as far as I can tell, you're not writing. So why don't you write for us? Which is, it's always good to have a friend who will sort of tell you the truth. And that's what Shep did that day. He spoke the truth to me. You know, he said, you had this dream and you've given up on it. So Dungeons and Dragons sounds stupid, but you're not doing anything else, so why not write for us? And it hit me. It really did. And I said, fine. I will write a Dungeons and Dragons adventure for you. So I went to the basement, and I had all my books still in a box alongside Mr. Compo's papers, and I took a month to relearn how to play Dungeons and Dragons, and I started writing Dungeons and Dragons adventures for my friends, about 5 of them. And they would get together, and they would, in the basement, play my adventures. And at first, I didn't go to their games. I would hand them, here you go, have a nice time. And I would get feedback from them. They really liked what I was doing. They really enjoyed playing my adventures. And I didn't kind of believe them. I thought they were just being nice to me, which would be unusual for them to be nice to me. So one day I went to the basement and I sat in the corner and I watched them play my adventure. And they did. They really enjoyed what I was writing. And for the first time since college, I had people reading my work and enjoying it and responding to it and giving me feedback when they thought something could be improved. And that went on for about a year. For about a year, I wrote Dungeons and Dragons adventures, and that got me writing again for people. It was really important to me that happened. And so after about a year, I called Shep. I called him, and I said, listen, I'm going to try to write a novel again, because I feel good about writing again. So I'm not going to write Dungeons and Dragons adventures for you anymore. And he said, well, why don't you do both? And I said, that's a great idea, but no. I'm not really enjoying that Dungeons and Dragons to begin with. I'm going to pass. And Shep says, that's fine. And he tells me, he says, when you have something you feel good about, I'll be your first reader. And Shep has been my first reader ever since. Every one of my books. When I send it out to someone, Shep is the first person that reads it. And he is the one who gets me probably better than anybody when I write. And so I decide I'm going to write again. And so I start working on novels, and I'm excited and I'm enthusiastic, and I write my first 30 pages of a novel, and I read it over, and it sounds like bad Dean Koontz again. Nothing has changed. Oddly enough, time passes, but if you don't learn anything, nothing changes. And so I'm stuck again, and I'm trapped in this world where I want to write something great, and I can't. And then the third person comes along to save me, and that person is Nana. Nana is my wife's grandmother. We just celebrated her 93rd birthday a couple weeks ago. But at the time, at this time in the story, she's about 85. But she's 85 going on 55 because she still drives, and she's got a home in the Berkshires and a home in New York and a home in Boca Raton, and she still dates and takes college classes. She's just one of those ladies. And we're going to Boca for the first time, my wife and I, to visit Nana before Clara was born, before I had any kids. And it's something my wife had done many times, but I had never done before. I didn't know Boca, the place where Jews go to die. So we're going to fly to Boca. Clara, you got to sit now. I just can't talk while you're grabbing my butt. I appreciate it. That's fine. And so we fly to Boca, and we don't rent a car because Nana's going to pick us up at the airport. And I don't understand anything about Boca, but Nana lives in one of these compounds, one of these enormous retiree compounds that have walls, and they're surrounded by golf courses. And I play golf, but no one bothered to tell me. So I just spend my days watching people do the thing I love, and I have no ability to do it. And Nana doesn't have Wi-Fi, and she doesn't have cable television, and I brought one book with me, and I'm done it in a day. And when you're at Nana's place, what happens is you go and you have breakfast at the club at 8 o'clock, and you talk about what you're going to have for lunch. And then you go to lunch at 11:30, and you talk about what you're going to go have for dinner. And then you leave the compound at 4 o'clock to go have dinner at like Joe's Stone Crabs, a restaurant. And then you come home, and that's it. That's all you do with it. She's got a pool, but that's it. Like, there's nothing to do. And if you want to leave the compound, because we didn't rent a car, because Nana picked us up, I have to walk 2.5 miles to the edge of the compound. And if I get there in the Florida heat, I can cross a 4-lane highway and I can go to Target, which I do like 3 times because it's better than the nothing that's happening in Nana's home. And my wife is excited because she likes to do nothing. She's just totally happy doing nothing. And I cannot do nothing for a second. So I'm losing my mind in Boca. And it's a Wednesday night. It's where I discover writing for the first time. Nana's not with us. She has brought us home from our Stone Crabs, and it's probably like 6 o'clock. And she has a date. She has a date with Joe, who is in the ICU unit at the local hospital, because she says that all of my boyfriends are slowly dying, and I have to visit them in the hospital. So she's going to see Joe in ICU, and then she's going to FAU for an opera class. And she's left us alone on the compound. And I have nothing to do. And my wife is just sitting, relaxing, and I'm stir crazy. But I have my laptop with me, and I have an idea for a story. About 3 months prior, I had sat down for dinner with my friend Justine, and she was upset. She had opened up her jewelry box, and there was only 1 earring in the jewelry box instead of the 2 she was looking for. She was missing one of the pair. And I guess this happens to ladies sometimes, where sort of 1 earring goes missing. And she didn't know what happened to it. And I said, well, maybe someone broke into your house and took one of the earrings but left the other one behind. That way you would never suspect burglary. And at that dinner, I remember thinking, that would be an interesting character to write a short story about. A guy who breaks into homes and steals 1 earring at a time, right? So that was just an idea I had in my mind, and it flittered in and just hung around, but that was it. And so that Wednesday night in Boca, I tell Alicia, I say, you know what? There's nothing for me to do. I'm going to write a short story about a guy who steals someone's earring. 1 earring from a woman. And my wife says, fine. Now, prior to this, whenever I had written novels, what I tried to do was I would go and I'd buy Post-it notes. I was really good at buying Post-it notes. So I'd go to Office Max and I'd buy like all these colors and shapes and sizes. And I had a big whiteboard. And I would figure out the plot of my story. And I would Post-it note it across the whiteboard. And then I would like think of my characters, and I'd write character traits, and I'd list them all on Post-it notes. I'd have this big, giant, beautiful board with my whole story planned out, and then I would write Bad Dean Koontz. Like just, that would become 30 pages of Bad Dean Koontz that I would throw away, and I'd tear all and I just have a lot of Post-it notes. I still have so many Post-it notes from these days. But in Boca, I didn't have my whiteboard, and I didn't have any Post-it notes. I had no way to plan my story. And I thought it was going to be a short story and not a novel. And so I just started writing without a plan. The only thing I knew was who this person was. His name was Martin, and I knew he was a burglar, and I knew he was going to break into people's homes and steal things that no one would notice were missing. And I thought it would make a good short story. So for the first time in Boca, without a plan, I started writing, and I discovered how to write. I discovered that I don't know what the hell is going to happen in my book in the next sentence. That when I write my novels, it is almost like reading the novels for me. That as I write them, I discover things just like readers do. A fraction of a second before a reader would discover it. So when my agent asks me now, like, what the book is about, I always say, here is what I think the book is going to be about, but it's never true. And she knows that. She understands how I write. And it turns out that about half the writers of the world write like I do. They don't know what the hell is about to happen in their book. They write, and somehow the words appear on the page, and it creates a story. I like to think that there's 2 kinds of writers. There are writers who use the front of their brain, like mystery writers, really talented writers, people like that who have a plan on what their story is going to be like. Those are front of the brain writers. And then there are people like me, back of the brain writers, or sort of subconscious writers, people who do the work unconsciously. And as long as we allow our fingers to move on the keyboard or our pen to move across the page, the writing actually happens. And what probably happened to people who don't write is you ran into some awful teacher who insisted that you fill out some rubric or some graphic organizer, or they insisted that you had to create a plan or an outline of your book ahead of time. And what happens is you write Bad Dean Koontz, and you don't like yourself very much, and then you stop writing, which is exactly what happened to me. I wouldn't be standing here if I hadn't gone to Boca and gotten bored on a Wednesday night. I promise you, because I would have been Post-it noting and whiteboarding it to this day. That's what I would have been doing. But I'm in Boca without a plan and without any Post-it notes, and I start writing, and for the first time in my life it feels good. And I write 3 chapters by the time I'm done in Boca. Over the next 3 days, I write about 30 pages. And Alicia, my wife, reads it, and she really likes it. And I asked Nana to read it, and Nana says, I can't read it because if it's crap, I have to tell you that it's crap. Because that's who she is. And I said, that's all right, I'm willing to risk it. And she reads it, and she says, in a very surprised tone, this is not bad. And that's how I feel. I'm like, this is not bad. And my wife says, like, what's the plan? What's going to happen in the book? And I said, I don't know what the fuck's going to happen. Like, this has never happened before. Like, I don't know what's in the next chapter. I don't know what's on the next page. And she says, all right. And so I go back to Connecticut, where I live, and I start writing. And I gather a group of 10 people to read with me, chapter by chapter as I write, because I grew up on video games. So I like to know my score at all times. So most writers, they'll write a book and no one sees it. Most of my author friends, they write books and no one could ever see it before it's done. And then only then, it's a loved one, a treasured loved one. For me, it was the 10 people willing to read my book, chapter by chapter. And I started writing and having them read and giving me that feedback. Today I have a data, I can't tell any of these people, but I have a database with like 50 people, and it has all their strengths and weaknesses. So I'm getting ready to write a book. I pick them based upon their strengths and weaknesses. So for Caroline Jacobs, for example, it's a book all about women. It was 9 women in Shep. Those were the people who read that book as I went along. But I started writing, and I didn't know what was going to happen, but the people were reading and they liked it, and it felt good for me. It was the first time that writing made sense to me. And so that's when I wrote I wrote constantly that book. It took me about 2 years to write it. And I'll never forget the day that I was finishing that book. It's Something Missing. It's my first novel. I feel like I'm near the end. And in the book, it's about a burglar named Martin who breaks into people's homes and steals things that go unnoticed. And what happens is he becomes sort of a fairy godmother to the people in the homes, because he gets affectionate towards these people who he never really meets, but he gets to know you by going through your things. And he's very obsessive compulsive, and he discovers that he's able to help people by breaking into their homes. He discovers things about them, and he can kind of make their lives better in the process, and that's what he does. And then some terrible thing happens where there's some legitimate danger for one of the homeowners, and Martin has to make a decision whether he's going to try to help this homeowner who's in some peril. And at the end of the book, all the options are available. Martin could live or die. He could end up in jail, or he could end up free. He could end up discovered for who he is, or he could continue to be completely anonymous to everyone whose lives he's touching. All of those things are available. And he's climbing a set of stairs at the end, and sort of at the top of the stairs he will meet his fate, and the book will be determined. It's a Saturday morning when I'm writing it, and my wife, who's out, calls me, and I say, I can't talk right now, I'm about to find out what happens to Martin. And she says, like, what happens to him? Because she's been waiting just like everybody else to find out. And I said, I don't know yet. I'm not at the top of the stairs. And I really don't. Like, that book could have ended any way. I'm convinced that there was a way it was supposed to end. And if I continued to move my fingers, I found the way that the book was supposed to end. And so I finished my first book that way. And I've been writing ever since. And now I'm 4 books in, and I've just handed in my 5th. But none of these things would have happened. None of them. If an English teacher doesn't let me stand in front of a class and make some girls laugh and feel like he might be able to change his future a little bit. And it doesn't happen unless my friend Shep calls me and says, you said you were going to be a writer and you're not being a writer. Write Dungeons and Dragons for me. Right? I probably quit and don't return to it. Not to fiction, at least. And it doesn't happen unless I go to Boca Raton and get bored on a Wednesday night and discover the way that I am supposed to write. The way that half the authors of the world write. And I went to college for writing, and no one bothered to tell me. Not a single professor, teacher, writer ever sat down and said, you know what, a lot of us, we don't know what we're doing. We're just writing sentence after sentence after sentence, and in the end we end up with a story. But none of those things happen for me, and I think that's why people don't write. My editor hates it when I tell people everyone should be writing. She says, no, everyone should not be writing. Now, should everyone be published? Perhaps not. But perhaps, maybe. It takes me about a year or 2 to write a book. Maybe it takes you 20. But, if you spent 20 years slowly crafting a novel that end up getting published, that's not bad. You're already better than most people at that point, right? And even if your book doesn't get published, even, if you were to heed my advice, which I know you're not going to do, because we will give our lives over to law and order a television show, which we all know how it ends at the end of every episode. We'll give our lives over to it, and I know we do because when I walk through the gym, I just see on the televisions, it's on every goddamn channel, on every goddamn exercise bicycle. But we'll give our lives over to television, but we won't give our lives over to writing. And so even if your book isn't published, I didn't think my book was going to get published. I never thought that Something Missing would ever end up in a bookstore shelf. What I honestly thought was going to happen was I was going to finish a novel, and then I would be able to say that I wrote a novel, which would make me better than most people who say they're going to write a novel and never do. And that would make me feel good about myself. I'd feel like at least my English degree gave me something. And then I probably would have put it in a basement, and I'd have a little girl someday named Clara. And Clara turns 16, and we get in a big fight. And I say some things that I really regret. And she goes off to her room, she slams the door. And I go into the basement, and I pull Something Missing out, and I dust it off. And I write on the front, "For Clara, with love." And I bring it up to her room, and I open the door, and I say, "Clara, can you forget everything that I just said? And can we look at this? I wrote a book a long time ago, and I'm kind of curious if it's any good. Can we read the first couple chapters and figure out if I did something good that day?" And if that's all that ever happened with my book, I'd be happy. I truly. But we allow the things that we think, and we allow the abilities we have, and we allow the talents that are lying dormant in each one of you. We allow them to just go away. And then one day you're going to die, and you're going to die with a whole bunch of stories. And there's going to be a whole bunch of people that will stand around and say, "You know what, I wish that he had written down some of his stories, or I wish she had written down some of the family stories that she used to tell." And there will be a lot of wishes because you didn't do your job, because you didn't go home and write. My grandfather, he died, and my grandfather was in World War II. He was a captain in the army, and he fought in France. And I knew he had stories. I knew he had great stories. And I said one day I'd write them down. I'd go and I'd see him, and I'd capture them all so that we'd never lose them. And then the son of a bitch died on me before I ever got the stories written down, right? And he didn't write them down either. And during a book talk I was doing a few years ago, I was talking about my grandfather, and I mentioned that to people as a way to admonish them to get writing. And I was in my hometown, and a man in the back of the talk, he raises his hand, and he says, "I knew your grandfather." And he said, "Do you know the story about," and he says, "a town in France." And I said, "No, I don't know what you're talking about." And he tells me the story, which I've later verified. He was a captain in the army, and they're getting ready to shell a French village that they think the Nazis are occupying. And they're going to shell it the next morning. And the mail comes in, the mail truck, and there's a letter from his wife, my grandmother. And in the letter it says, "I'm so happy to hear that the town has been liberated because we have friends in that town. Do you remember? Because they're French. They're from France." And he doesn't know that the town's been liberated. They're about to shell the town that the Nazis are no longer occupying. And it's that letter from my grandmother that prevents that town from being shelled. That story is lost forever if I don't do a talk in Blackstone, Massachusetts, and a man in the back of the room raises his hand and says, "Hey, did you hear that story?" Right? Because I'm an idiot, because I didn't write it down. And my grandfather, "You're an idiot because you didn't write it down." And you will go home and you will not write your stories down. So even if you don't plan on being published, even if you don't have a 16-year-old girl that you think you're going to say a mean thing to someday, imagine the gift that you give to future generations, even if you write like crap. Just imagine it for a minute. Would you like a book by your grandmother, even if it's written like crap, but it tells her story, and it tells you like what she was like when she was 32 years old, or what life was like for her when she was 16? You know, wouldn't that be a beautiful thing to have? And it's something within each one of you. You could give it to your future generations if you will turn the television off and pick up a pen. So I apologize because I know I'm a little aggressive on that, but I'm an English teacher, and I've been an elementary school teacher, so I believe in the capacity of all. I truly do. I believe that every person is capable of the things that I'm talking about. And I have to believe that because I work with 10-year-olds, and every one of those kids, as stupid as they look sometimes, I believe in their capacity, and I believe they're going to do great things if they choose to do great things. And I believe that you can do the same thing. If I don't run into Mr. Campo and Shep and Nana and Boca, I'm not standing here, right? I'm an idiot. I truly am an idiot. I am not an impressive person. There are impressive writers in the world, you know. There are writers. I was just on stage a couple years ago with a man named Ben Dolnick, a really great writer. And he's a talented man. And so the moderator at this talk we're doing, he says, "Can you tell us what your next books are going to be about?" To me and Ben. And Ben, I swear to you, he says basically this. He says, I was thinking of taking a Proustian approach to my next novel, but I went and read the short stories of Alice Munro, and I was fascinated by the way that the family can push against the self and influence and craft the person into who they are, and how you have to push against family and yet at the same time embrace it. And so that is what my book is going to be about. And then Ben turns to me and says, "What about you, Matt?" And I said, "I just kind of make some stuff up and I write it down and I try to make a good story, and occasionally I want you to laugh and maybe cry at the end." That's I don't know, I just make stuff up. I have no idea. That's me, and that's you, right? You could be that person. You do not have to take a Proustian approach or read the short stories of Alice Munro and apply those lessons. You can just make some stuff up. Or you can just write about your own life, If you don't want to write fiction, just write something about yourself. And what? Could you imagine if you spent 15 minutes a day writing? 15 minutes. We lose 15 minutes like that. We let 15-minute chunks of our lives pass away like they're meaningless, and they're the most precious things that we have. Okay, on the last day of your life, you're not going to be thinking, "God, I wish I had watched Moth in order. I wish I'd had the television on a little bit more," right? It's not the case. You're going to say, "I drove to a lot of grocery stores," right? I drove to a lot of grocery stores for food that really wasn't that much better than the other grocery store. Marginally better. And I could have been doing something else. What? Charlie pooped on the potty. That's a big deal. That is a first. That means we have to go to the toy store and buy him a lot of toys. That was worth the interruption, I gotta say. That was very impressive. I have no idea what I was saying anymore. I'm sure I was yelling at you that you're not writing. This is a good way to sell books, by the way. You yell at people and tell them they're dumb to not write, and they really want to buy your book. It's a perfect way to get people excited about my books. But truly, truly, I am not a talented person. I am not a gifted person. I am just a person. When people ask me how have I managed to achieve the success I've had, I say, I have a greater commitment to keeping my ass in a chair than most people. That is it, right? And most people have that commitment. They just have a screen in front of them while it's happening. And the screen that I have is blank, and I have to put words on it. That's the only difference. We just look at different screens. I look at a blank screen and put words on it. Other people look at a screen with pictures on it, and they sit passively. So give 15 minutes of your life every day to do something, if not for yourself, but for someone who is not yet alive, but will desperately want to know who you were when you're not here anymore. Because those people exist. There are hundreds of people who are not alive right now that will desperately wish they knew something about you when you're gone. And they will have a tombstone that they can read, and maybe some stories that people kind of remember for a little while, and then those will be gone too. But if you write a little bit every day, it'll be a gift to future generations. It truly will. So buy my books. That's great. You should buy them in bulk, my wife says. Buy a lot of them now for Christmas before they sell out. They're going to be like Beanie Babies and Cabbage Patch Kids. They're going to be so hard to find in December. So get them while you can. But if you do anything, skip my books and go home and write. Go home and write. And if you do it, you can send me an email. That'll make me feel good, and I like to feel good. It's Matthew Dix, my name, @gmail.com. And if you're worried about remembering it, you should buy one of my books because it's got my name on it. So it's just my name. You can I will write @gmail.com for you on the bottom when I sign it so you can get in touch with me. I'd love to hear it, though. And if you write a book, I've had 2 people. I've been telling people to write for a long time. I've had 2 people write books. Neither one's been published, but I've read both of them, and I've offered to blurb both of them if they find a publisher. And I'll tell you, the 2 people who have written those books, they are damn proud of the work that they did. And if it never ends up in a store like this, they're still damn proud of what they have. And the people in the future, they will be really happy for what they've gone and done. So I hope you do that. I truly do. And I'd be happy to take any questions that you have now that I've berated you for a very long time. And I don't have a prize tonight. I feel terrible. I usually bring a prize for the most inappropriate question. At my first reading ever, a woman asked me, she said, "How do your ex-girlfriends play a role in your fiction?" Which, it was my first reading, so I just realized, I thought, wow, people ask really weird stuff at book talks. But I love the question because I'm a storyteller. So when she asks me that question, the first thing I say is, "Why do you ask me that question?" And she says, "Because you look like the kind of guy who has a lot of ex-girlfriends," which to this day could go either way, right? It's either good or I flip all the time on that one. I'm just not. I think it was bad though. By her tone, I think it was not a positive situation. But I love the question because I was able to tell funny stories about ex-girlfriends and make everyone laugh, and that was so I love that. So if you have a question that's sort of inappropriate, it's totally fine. Usually I give a prize to the most inappropriate question, but I forgot. The prizes actually are crap anyway. They're my books get published in other countries, and when that happens, they send you 10 copies of your book. So the first time I got 10 copies of the German version of Something Missing, and I was so proud of it. Like I couldn't believe it. So I put all 10 copies on the shelf. And then you only have to walk by the shelf once before you realize that's a really douchey thing to do. Like, you don't need 10 copies of your German book that you can't read on a shelf. So you take 9 of them off, and you leave one up there, and you put the 9 in a box, and you put it under your desk, and then the cat pees on the box and ruins 5 of them. So then you buy Tupperware bins, so even if the cat pees on them, they'll be safe. And then they start stacking up, because my Memoirs was published in like 26 countries. So, like, you can imagine how many books pile up that no one wants, that I can't read, and will just sit here forever. So I give those away. So you end up with a book that is as meaningless to you as it is to me, unless you happen to speak Turkish, which you don't. So you like bring it to work and go, hey, look, I have a Turkish book. You realize nobody cares about it and ends up in the trash, but it's not in my office anymore, which is the key. So that's the prize I usually have. So I'm sorry I don't have my crappy prize tonight. I forgot to grab one, but if you do have a question, I'd be happy to take it. But it's fine if you don't. I'm a teacher, so this is wait time. It's a thing. No, you wait for a minute, and then you're like, okay, it's okay if you don't have questions.
Well, this is not inappropriate, but...
appropriate questions are great, too.
Okay. I'm just curious what you like to read.
What do I like to read? I like to read everything but romance, I think.
Because you've only mentioned Dean Koontz.
That's a good point. I haven't really... Well, I read a lot of things. I don't... I read Shakespeare. Which it sounds like ridiculous, but it's true. I read it with my 5th graders. We read Shakespeare every year, and then we perform a play. I'm on vacation right now, and so are they. And they're all preparing a scene from Romeo and Juliet for their auditions when they get back. And we read the original text. I read a novelization of it first, so that they understand what the story is, and then we dig into the original text, and they understand what's supposed to be happening, so they can kind of figure out what's happening. I'm still waiting for the day when I ask someone, what are you reading? And they say, like, Hamlet. Right? It's really great, though. Like, if 10-year-olds like it and understand it, you can, too. It's another one of those things, people ruin writers, teachers ruin writers because they're not writers, and then they go and they teach writing, and then they ruin people. The same thing with Shakespeare. He gets, like, this terrible reputation as being difficult to read, and he's not difficult to read. Like, he's fantastic. I have a book of Shakespearean insults. Real insults from the plays, and I have my kids memorize the Shakespearean insults, and then we have Shakespearean insult contests in my class where they shout the insults at each other, and it's the best thing. They just love it. So I read Shakespeare, but I'm not reading Shakespeare right now. I read a lot of nonfiction when I'm writing fiction, and I'll read almost anything. I like memoir quite a bit. I like biographies quite a bit. When I'm reading fiction, I'll read almost anything. My favorite author is Kurt Vonnegut, probably at the moment. I read, what's the car salesman? Breakfast of Champions was the first of his books that I wrote. And Kurt Vonnegut is a character in Breakfast of Champions. He appears as himself in the book. And that was a huge thing for me as a writer, because I read that, and when he appeared as a character in his book, it made me realize there are no rules in writing. That I can do whatever the hell I want. If you can appear in your own book, you can do whatever the hell you want. So I love Kurt Vonnegut quite a bit. He passed away, and I cried that day. And Timequake is the last book of his that I haven't read, and I read a page a week because I don't want there to never be any new Kurt Vonnegut for me. So it sits on my desk at school. I read it like a page a week, and sometimes I don't. I just go back and start rereading. But I'm sort of determined to end that book on the day I die. That's my goal, so that I will always have new Vonnegut in my life throughout my entire life. Just a little. My kids think I'm crazy. I tell my 10-year-olds this, and they're like, "You are a crazy man, Mr. Dix." Maybe I am crazy, but I love him. So I love Vonnegut. I like Stephen King quite a bit. I think he has some really terrible books, and he would tell you they're terrible, particularly the ones when he was addicted to drugs. They're really just about his drug addiction, masked in some monster story. But I think he writes some fantastic books. I think he's like the storyteller of our generation that is not being recognized for what he is. He's like, Edgar Allan Poe died sort of unrecognized for who he was, and I think King will be the same way. The difference is Stephen King has like $49 million, and Edgar Allan Poe had 3 cents in a gutter. So I don't feel bad for Stephen King for sort of not being recognized for the story. I think, obviously by the masses he is, but I think we're going to recognize him as being a great storyteller in a more literate way than we recognize him today. So I always like to talk about him. I think he's fantastic. So those are a couple. I'll read almost anything. Right now I'm reading... What am I reading? Oh, I'm reading Piper Kerman's Orange is the New Black. My wife read it like 2 years ago, and she kept talking about how great it was, and she was overselling it. When someone oversells something, so I had to wait, because I was like, she's overselling it, I'm just not going to like it as much as she did. So I waited a long time, and I just started, she doesn't know I'm reading it. I'm sort of silently reading it, so I can talk to her later about it, and be like, I read it, and she'll be happy, and we'll have a wonderful conversation. Then maybe we'll actually watch the show someday. We don't watch a lot of TV, though, so it's hard for us. So that's what I'm reading now. Thank you for the question. Actually, let me tell you one more thing. I think Kate DiCamillo's book, The Tale of Despereaux, I love to mention that book. It is a fantastic book. It's a children's book, but it's not a children's book. It's a novel. You can read it in 2 hours. It is a great, great book. It is about a mouse named Despereaux who chooses to be different. And like when you read my books, the thing that I am always most interested in my novels is I like to write about the people on the fringes of society. I like to write about the people who would as a teacher and as a parents, we tell our kids to grow up and be themselves and to fight against peer pressure and to blaze your own trail. And what happens is if you're actually a person who does that and you become an adult, it's often a very difficult life for you when you're blazing your own trail and ignoring peer pressure. If you're becoming the person who doesn't conform to what everyone expects. And so I like to write about people who do that. I think the bravest thing a person can do is to be themselves when everyone around them doesn't want them to be themselves. Like I think that's the most noble thing a person can do. And so I'm kind of interested in characters like that. And The Tale of Despereaux is about a mouse who falls in love with a human princess and loves books and loves light, all the things he's not supposed to love. And he discovers that it's a very difficult road to hoe when you choose to be different. There's a great line in that book that says, an interesting fate awaits anyone, man or mouse, who chooses not to conform. And I just love that idea. So that is a great book. And it'll take you 2 hours to read. You will love it, and then you can read it to a kid, and they will love it too. It's very unusual, I think, that you can find a book that truly adults and children will both love on a really literary level. Not just sort of that was fun to read, but like that was a beautiful thing that we just read together. So I love that book. Anything else? It's okay if there's not. We can drink wine. I thank you. There's fantastic food in the back. I watched it being made. I did not participate in the making of it, which makes it better than had I participated in the making of it. So please partake and thank Denise and Jim for their kindness in bringing it. And go home and write. Like buy a book, but go home and write. Buy a bunch of books. Actually, support this bookstore. Bookstores like this. It is nice to hear that they're actually, it looks like they're thriving. It looks like they're coming back. It looks like people have recognized the importance of an independent bookstore in their town. I don't have one in my town right now. I have a Barnes & Noble, and I'm happy to have it. I'm happy to have a place where I can go and bring my kids and we can look at books. And it's a lovely bookstore, and I love it. But I know I can walk up to staff, and she will know things about hundreds of books in the store. And if I walk into Amazon, it's a lovely store, but no one knows a damn thing about books in that store. So there's a value to that. And so buy lots of books tonight, and always buy lots of books here, and to go home and write, and that'd be a wonderful thing. So thank you for being here. I really appreciate it.